Hello and welcome to another episode of TWIML Talk, the podcast where I interview interesting people doing interesting things in machine learning and artificial intelligence. I'm your host, Sam Charrington. As we approach TWIMLCon AI platforms, I'd like to let you all in on our first major announcement from the conference. Now, you all love this podcast for great guests and interviews, and we're bringing that concept right to the TWIMLCon stage. I am super excited to announce that Andrew Ng will be joining me on stage at TWIMLCon for a live keynote interview. Many of you know Andrew from his work at Stanford, Coursera, or his many other efforts in the industry, including recently founding deeplearning.ai. Andrew and his work have been super impactful on my life and career, and I know that's the case for many of you as well. In our conversation, we'll be discussing the state of AI in the enterprise, the barriers to using deep learning in production and how to overcome them, his views on tooling and platforms for efficient AI delivery, and other topics from his recently published AI Transformation Playbook. Be on the lookout for more great speaker announcements rolling out over the course of the next few weeks. You don't want to miss this event. Get your tickets now at twimlcon.com/register. All right, everyone, I am on the line with Stephen Odaibo. Stephen is the founder, CEO, and chief software architect at Retina-AI. Stephen, welcome to This Week in Machine Learning and AI.
Thanks so much, Sam. It's such an honor to be on the show here with you.
It's great to have you on the show. So you are an MD, a medical doctor, in addition to having a background in math and science, or math and computer science. Can you elaborate a bit on your background and how you kind of made your way into working on artificial intelligence?
Yeah, most certainly. You know, as you said, I'm a physician, I'm an ophthalmologist, a retina specialist, computer scientist, mathematician, and a full stack AI engineer. And you know, it's sort of been a journey that I've really enjoyed along the way. There wasn't sort of a grand plan at the beginning to sort of do all of this. But yeah, I started out at University of Alabama in undergrad, and I was a math major. I really enjoyed that. But the entire way I was a pre-med student, so I was med school bound. And the program I was in was an NSF-funded program called the Fast Track program. So I got a master's degree in the course of that. And it was a phenomenal place, you know, great mentorship. And it was, and I would say a little bit of a however, it was pure math, which it's also a great advantage, but I found that I had some work to do when I graduated. So we were, in the course of the program, focusing on, you know, abstract algebra, you know, topology and things like that. And I remember probably halfway through grad school, through the master's part of it, looking at a friend of mine and saying, you know, where the heck did 3 go and where's 15? You know, there were no more numbers. It was all whatever happened to 71? You know, I haven't seen that number in so long. You know, it was all symbols. You know, you use, right, you know, the reals and the complex and so on. But from there, I went to medical school, went to Duke, and was in an MD-PhD program, started out. And I went to the biochemistry department, worked with Bob Lefkowitz, who ended up with the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2012. And, you know, I enjoyed my time in the lab. It was phenomenal. I was 2 years there. But somewhere in that course, I had sort of an awakening during the grad school part of my med school journey. And it became clear that I sort of wanted to continue what had started in Alabama with the math.
Huh.
And it was clear to me that it wasn't going to happen with the traditional pathway in the way biology is done. Biology is done sort of like looking for a needle in a haystack. You know what I mean, Sam?
In what sense?
It's less systematic. I think some of that is going to change. It's the notion of there are certain people who, by virtue of their position or insights and prior success, judgment, whatever you want to say, are able to pick the problems that are interesting. And there's a lot of arbitrariness to that process. And craft the story around it, and something about that felt incomplete, you know, to me. I wanted now looking back, I think I wanted the era of big data where we could more systematically search for things and we could more systematically draw conclusions and have more faith in the conclusions that we draw in science.
Does that speak broadly to kind of the difference between the way we approach science generally and more of an engineering type of an approach?
It's not even old science versus engineering, because the engineering thing has changed too, right? In the last 5 years, for example, in machine learning, there was the era of feature engineering, which was more along the lines of the way biology was done. Is you manually look for features and manually craft them, even design them explicitly yourself, versus using an optimization type approach where you're letting the data tell its own story and you're sort of sitting back as a judge, as opposed to you're the script writer.
Ah, got it. Interesting analogy there.
So anyway, I had that, which coincided with a spiritual awakening as well, and I decided, I have to go back to so I decided to go to the computer science department, and at that point, and I switched, and I started to reignite the math there with numerical analysis, and I had work to do because my flavor of math was pure and abstract, and here I was realizing that if I was going to impact the world, you have to sort of go through the computer. And that means hard numbers. That means matrices. That means matrix multiply. Right? So, that was a blast. And I would say that was probably the hardest part of my journey was getting back into the game in terms of math computer, because I was having to really pick up new skills as well. And that was at Duke also, the computer science department. I was going to get a PhD there in computer science. I passed the qualifying exams, et cetera, and I acquired all my skills. Had a falling out with my advisor, and then I moved on. At that point, I got the master's, no problem, and went back to medical school. But then I had just one more year to finish med school. Finished that, and then stayed at Duke for my intern year. And by then I was back in the game, clinically. Went to Howard for my ophthalmology residency, which was a lot of fun. At that point, I was already committed, right? I already knew that I have to keep doing this math thing. I've paid enough of a price to where I was never gonna let it go. And so even during the course of my residency, I wrote a book on quantum mechanics, for instance, and then went to the University of Michigan for a fellowship in retina. And I loved Michigan. I visited Ann Arbor. It was a really intellectual mecca, was the way that I saw it. And there was something really pure about the place in terms of what people at least aspired to. They really took, I felt that they really took academic pursuit as a primary gain, as opposed to something for a secondary gain for recognition or money or whatever. At the end of the day, we're all human, and there's always that going on, right? There's always the politics, there's always stuff, but I felt Michigan stood out in terms of its the genuineness of its commitment. And so it was my first choice, and I could, coming out of Howard, I could have gone anywhere in the country. So I went to Michigan as my first choice for fellowship. And it was really good. I wanted to stay in the academy at that point, but the irony was, during the course of my time there, it started to dawn on me that if I'm really going to be able to make a difference, if I'm really going to be able to use computer science, math, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do at that point, but it dawned on me that if I really was going to do that, it was sort of a real epiphany, a surprise, that I needed to sort of craft my own career. I really had to go to private practice to become a true academic. I couldn't do it at the university because there were these programs that were set up. People said you have to fit into this box, right? Mm-hmm. And there was not a sense of, that's just the way it is. There was not a sense of, go do whatever you want. Nobody says that.
Right.
Nobody lets anybody do that. And I get it, So I picked the job. I went to Iowa. I worked 3 days out of the week. And it being private practice, you pay your own salary. And so it was no problem. And the rest of the time I did academics on my own. And there I wrote a book on finite group theory, started getting more into the pure and theoretical part. I've always sort of oscillated between the applied concrete real, and the celestial ecclesiastic. The clouds, I've always kind of gone between the two. And so I was all the way in the clouds, when I was in Iowa, and I wrote that book on finite group theory. And then at that point, my brother, David Odaibo, who is co-founder of Analytical AI, he was ranked 70th in the world in Kaggle. And so he started telling me, because I had left grad school at that point, and he started telling me that there's this thing called deep learning. I was basically a PhD holder in effect in computer science, who finished and left the computer world in 2010. And I had never heard the word deep learning.
Right.
And I was at Duke, for that matter, right? There was no such thing. The whole thing about AI, so on and so forth, there was nothing like that. Machine learning was the most boring class you can think about. It was horrible. I mean, with Markov chains and so on, it's things that are now so exciting. The most exciting things in science were really, we're really in the cover. Buried deep inside of textbooks that were gathering dust. And so anyway, my brother told me that this thing is so exciting, what he's doing, because he was in grad school at the time, at the University of Alabama. I had left, and then he had been working. He's a year older than I am, and he had gone back to grad school. And he said he's doing deep learning. It's so exciting. He says he's doing these things, and he kept talking about it. And eventually one day at Christmas, we were spending the Christmas at their place in Birmingham, and he kept talking. I said, okay, let me take a look. What is this? And he said it's something to do with images and image classification. And I said, that's what I do in my work. Like, I basically look at a picture. Depending on what the picture tells me, I go and I decide whether I'm going to stick a needle in somebody's eyeball and administer injections. Or I determine whether I'm going to do laser surgery on that person, all based off of the picture. And so he said, really? I said, yeah. I said, it's all the picture. The picture guides the treatment. And so he said, no kidding. So at that point,
you have a much more the stakes involved in image classification are perhaps much more tangible for you.
Absolutely. And none of this was abstract at all, because I'll do 40 injections in one day. I sometimes see 50 patients a day, and I'm literally running from room to room. Mm-hmm. And so so at that point I was studying for my boards, the ophthalmology boards, which that's a whole different story. We could do a whole nother session on that, Sam. They put you in a hotel room and they ask you these questions. Literally, there's like a bed there at somebody's hotel. You walk in and they're asking you questions on the 10 different areas of the eye. And so ophthalmology is its own thing in that way. So anyway, I was studying for this exam that everybody dreads. So I said, okay, let me knock the boards out of the way, and then I'll take a look at this thing. So I finished my boards in 2016, November, and I started studying. I said, okay, I'm going to look at deep learning, and took a trip to Nigeria, which was already planned. It was Christmas, and that was when I first opened the book. I looked at it. I said, let me look at this deep learning thing. And then I said, okay, very interesting.
Which
and then
was I got back. Do you remember the book?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, it's actually not a book. It was nobody reads books anymore.
I was curious if it was one of the kind of the classic books, but
no.
Okay, got it. We're speaking metaphorically, which is fine.
Metaphorically, you got it. It was the book was the metaphoric book was the CS 231 course by Karpathy. Andrej, that was the book.
Got it.
So I looked at the book and I said, holy smokes, this is good stuff. And then next thing I pulled up a Medium article with some Keras code in it and Python. They actually had a tutorial on Python on the 231 course. And so I pulled out that tutorial. I have a grad degree in computer science. So it took me a week to pick up Python and so on. And then I ran the MNIST training. Mm-hmm. And the Keras was basically I copy pasted it into the Jupyter notebook, and I saw the thing, numbers running, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is fascinating. And so I wired up actual imaging data to it, and when I saw the accuracy that was coming out,
meaning clinical imagery data.
clinical
or like
imagery data.
MNIST data?
No, after I did the MNIST thing,
Okay.
then I actually took clinical data, actual patients, data, and I ran that, an image classifier on that, and based on the accuracy that was coming out, my jaw dropped, Sam. I was like, wow, okay, this is a game changer. And I'll never forget that night. In that point, it dawned on me that there's about to be a revolution, that really everything is going to change. And so my brother and I got to talking. I launched out the company, Retina-AI. He helped me with it. And he turned out he was involved with so much at the time. He was doing his Kaggle thing. He was ranked 70th in the world on Kaggle. He was a part of 2 other startups. He was completing his PhD, and so he had a lot going on. So he said I should carry on my own, with it. And that turned out to be a good thing. It was challenging for me, but I had no backup, Sam. So you can imagine that's really where I became a full stack AI engineer, because I had left my job, where in full disclosure, where I was probably making 5 or 10 times what I thought I would ever make in my life. And I left that job. And I left it because I thought I had a backup. I thought there was the person who was going to be the CTO, who's going to do all the actual hard work. And I'm just going to be like, a talking head, no problem. I enjoy that. I'll run around, talk about what we're doing, connect with folks and kind of get things moving along and, talk to investors and that type of thing and go give some clinical talks. But here I was, and I had to build a product, and I had to put out an MVP, and I had to do all of that. And so I had to pick up a bunch of things along the way. So we built a mobile app, and I had to pick up Swift and build the iOS, and then pick up Kotlin and Java script, and put out the Android version of this. And I had to learn how to host models in the web, in the cloud, how to serve, and how I had to get into some details with serverless stuff as well as RESTful APIs and the like, and Docker containerization and all the nitty gritty stuff that I quite honestly didn't think it was even. I didn't even conceive that it was even possible for a physician to ever be doing anything like that. But I was sort of forced into it, and I'm really thankful for that. But anyway, so our company is Retina-AI Health Incorporated. I weathered that storm last year, and at the end of the year, started talking to investors, got a few angels together, all physicians who, they wrote checks enough that we're going to be around this year for sure, and next year as well, and maybe forever, maybe
Sounds like you've definitely made the transition to startup life.
Yes. Yeah. So that's sort of the short story. And just in quick summary of what the company is, we are using machine learning to build autonomous systems that diagnose retinal diseases, as well as diagnose systemic diseases from pictures of the retina. For example, cardiovascular risk. Somebody who's that guy who's playing golf and looks really healthy and is 55, and suddenly you find out that this person dropped dead of a heart attack, a massive heart attack, and has a young family. It turns out that we are coming closer to be able to accurately find out who that person is by just looking in their eyes and saying, you really need to get to a heart doctor, you really need to change your diet, you really need to be on anti-cholesterol medicines, beta blockers, and the like, to prevent something like that. So it's a big market, it's a big space, and it's really exciting.
Can you maybe contextualize what Retina-AI is doing relative to some of the other activities in the space? As you can imagine, you are paying even more attention to it than I am, and there are announcements happening constantly about folks using these particular types of images to make various predictions. DeepMind in UK had a tie-up with the NHS there around using retinal images. I did an interview with a Google developer who was doing some work around some of what you were just talking about, predicting cardiovascular risk factors based on these retinal fundus images. Can you maybe contextualize, maybe talk a little bit about kind of the broad landscape of, what's happening in this space and how what you're doing fits into that?
Yeah, great question, Sam. It's early days, and there's the problem is so big, and the potential for impact is so compelling that both large companies as well as small startups are interested. Google has interest in this area. As you said, DeepMind, where is working with the NHS, and they recently put out an image classifier with I think they said 50 different retinal diseases and that sort of thing. That's it's for us a standard problem. We have a similar classifier with even more diseases that we're about to roll out here. Microsoft is interested in this as well, and has a platform that they're working on, and Google is also working with Aravind Eye Hospital in India, looking at the issue of diabetic retinopathy screening. There are startups, some that are large and have raised significant amount of capital, such as IDX, which is based out of Iowa City, Michael Abramoff's company, that received FDA approval for a device to do autonomous screening for diabetes and diabetic retinopathy. So there are a number of people interested because it's such a large space in terms of both the market as well as the humanitarian potential for a real positive impact. Diabetes is a big focus for a lot of these companies as well as for us. For instance, the U.S. has about 9 or 10% of our population is diabetic. And that number is over 35 million people. And when you talk about prediabetes, there's over 86 million people. That's people who, if not diagnosed and treated, will develop diabetes within 5 years. That's 86 million people. And on a worldwide scale, it's a lot larger. It's 500 million people, with diabetes. And about 1.5 million people die every year, from the disease. So the real issue here is that in terms of human labor, physicians, it takes so long to train a doctor, and there's no hope there for us to use human power to train physicians to be able to diagnose this and to be able to. The world's population is growing much faster than we're turning out physicians, and so the problem is worsening. So AI is compelling and is actually necessary to be able to address the problem, and so a lot of people are working in this area. And there's competition. There's also collaboration. It's all very good. For instance, at the National Medical Association's annual meeting, which is going to be in Hawaii this year, I'm going to be chairing a panel on more broadly innovations in ophthalmology. But I've geared it and focused it towards diabetic retinopathy. And so we have the technical lead from Google Brain Team, Dale Webster, working on this diabetic retinopathy. He's going to be there on the panel, and that's Dale Webster. And then Anusha Trivedi she works in Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft's office in healthcare AI, and she's the lead on that. And so I invited her. She's going to be there as well. She's also working on diabetic retinopathy. And then Michael Abramoff, who's the founder of IDX, he's going to be on the panel as well. And so we collaborate, we're looking at it, we're thinking about it. The truth of the matter is it's such an enormous problem that it's great to share ideas and see how everybody can move forward together.
And so can you maybe talk in a little bit more detail about your approach and some of the research you've published in this space and how it is everyone kind of doing the same thing applied to different data sets, or are folks taking, either dramatically different or, different in novel ways, types of approaches? Like, what distinguishes the different things that are happening in the space?
Right. This is great question, Sam. So, yeah, there's a lot of commonality, a lot of similarity. When everyone goes to these machine learning conferences, there's no, in terms of the actual techniques that are being used, there's nothing that's enormously novel, right? Everybody, there's only Python and there's only Keras and PyTorch and there's not that many tools that we're using to execute the job. Approaches do differ, and access to data, differs, and that's sometimes more data is not always necessarily a good thing, which is a separate topic. It depends on the type of data that one has access to, and then one's understanding and knowledge of the specific domain. And so I think that's where we stand out. Because of my experience as a physician and ophthalmologist, I'm a retina specialist, also a full stack AI engineer, and I built the entire prototype, our first prototype on my own, end to end. I think what that does for us is it gives us a very unique perspective. We can innovate very quickly. For example, one of the papers that I just published 2 weeks ago was using a generative adversarial network to generate artificial data for data augmentation. And I generated a certain type of scan called an OCT of the retina, and I passed it along to a few of my colleagues who are also retina specialists. And I was impressed to see that at least half of people didn't get all of them right. And these are experts, who look at these images all day. There are certain differences. The smaller startups who have more integrated domain knowledge can move quicker and can innovate, quicker in that space. And so everybody's going to have to work together, and that's what we're doing. We're currently in the Google Cloud platform, startup program. So we get some benefits from having access to cloud infrastructure. That helps us, and we're currently also looking to further some ties with some of the other larger companies to see how everybody can move forward together.
So that's a really interesting perspective on the way these markets will evolve. And I want to dive into the GANs work that you've done. But before we do that, let's linger here for a second. What strikes me as interesting is there was a period of time, maybe 3-4 years ago, when everyone kind of believed that that AI was going to be totally driven by access to data, and it was going to be a handful of large companies that would kind of lock up all of the data and thus build all of the best models, and everyone else would be frozen out. And I think that's changing, right? That perception is changing, and you touched on some of the reasons why. Can you elaborate on what you see there?
Yeah, exactly. People even just 24 months ago, people were saying, "Oh wow, throw in the towel, don't worry about it. Google's interested. They've looked at it, and so it's over." We always said, it was as people were saying that I was leaving my job, because I absolutely didn't believe it. So one thing that I tell people is data is everywhere. And data has always been everywhere, and it's kind of like oil, like natural gas. It really is everywhere. You dig deep enough anywhere, you'll strike oil somewhere. But it's really difficult to set up the rigs to know how to find the oil and how to extract it and convert it into something useful, into gas, into fuel, into natural gas for one's vehicle, for instance.
Just to jump in there, I'm not sure that's the best analogy for your position, in the sense that actual exploration and extraction of oil is hugely resource intensive and is kind of the domain of the big oil companies as opposed to small. I don't know this market, so I may be totally wrong, but I'm assuming that it's, that is kind of one of these things where it's kind of dominated by, huge energy companies and state-owned players and things like that.
Right. Yeah. That's one part that the analogy doesn't quite work, because it's actually the opposite in the case of in this era where a kid in Nigeria or Ghana who has access to the internet, and has a laptop, can train a machine learning algorithm.
Right.
So it's other than that part, the analogy. The point there is that knowing the data, having domain expertise, which is what these oil companies have, having domain expertise and knowing what to do with data, that's actually what's very expensive. And in this case, it's the analogy does work, where expensive in a more general sense of the word, it's hard to come by. It's so expensive that Google can't afford it, right? In the sense that, and that's part of their strategy. They recognize that, and so a lot of these big companies have venture arms that look to partner or acquire smaller startups, because that's where the rubber hits the road, is in the domain expertise coupled with the engineering know-how, allows people to find meaningful insights inside of data.
And so another comment that you made was that more data is not necessarily a good thing. And that goes against kind of the common wisdom as well in this space. Can you elaborate on that?
It totally does. Yes, yes. So more data is not always a good thing. And for example, one of the reasons why, generative adversarial networks have been thought of as, more powerful than preceding generative models is because they can somehow find different pockets where there's enough variation inside of a probability distribution of a certain data type. But that's only so true to a certain extent. Otherwise, what one might be getting is sort of an averaging or a blurring of a certain part of the data. That's one example where knowing how to pick the data, understanding what the implications in the various pockets of variation within a data sample mean in the real world, is priceless. One example of where this played out is with the RSNA Kaggle competition, in which the top 10 finalist winners were all radiologists who have somehow along the way acquired ML skills. And there's no substitute for that. And that's sort of always going to be the case. Another example is knowing when to halt training of an algorithm. With your standard supervised learning type problem, you can sort of go off of your loss function. You can say that the losses drop below a certain threshold, we're going to stop, we're doing great. That process is governed by the data, of course. So assuming that you had good data, you can safely trust your halt point. But in the case of, say, a GAN, the ultimate arbiter is still the human visual cortex. It's still a human being who understands what a dog or a cat should look like, because you've got these two competing algorithms that are fighting with each other, and the loss itself is clearly now insufficient. And so one can't stop training again when the loss drops below a certain point, because the adversariality, the push and pull that the discriminator and generator are doing to each other continues past a certain point. So you don't really know when to stop. And there's no real quantitative approach that we currently have for knowing when to stop training these GAN algorithms. And so because adversarial examples are another way that make that very apparent, that you really ultimately still need the domain expertise. It's an enormous value in today in ML. And I think I think people are starting to get that. The initial big hype and excitement that computers are going to take over is starting to dampen. And people are starting to realize that the only real way forward is going to be domain specific, and it's going to be with really integrated interdisciplinary teams, and ideally people who have detailed expert level knowledge of both the ML side as well as whatever other field that they're looking to apply ML to, be it agriculture, be it transportation, be it healthcare.
Tell me a little bit about your experience getting up to speed with GANs, ultimately resulting in this paper you published.
Oh yeah, it's I thought, well, this could be interesting. It started with a theoretical question. I was giving a talk, and somebody asked me in the audience. I was actually giving a talk in Nigeria, where I went for a data science Nigeria. They invited me in January, just last month. 2 months ago. We're already in March here. And somebody brought up whether GANs could be used for augmentation of data. And my initial inkling, I hadn't really worked with GANs at that point, only really a month ago. And my inkling was to say, no, I don't see it. I don't see a person pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. That it's your GAN model, your generative model, what it's able to generate is necessarily constrained or bounded in terms of its accuracy, in terms of its fidelity to the actual native data set, is bounded by the initial sample from that data distribution, which is your training data for the discriminator. Mm-hmm. That was my response, but I kept thinking about it though, that was that correct? Is that true? And it is, I'm still there. And so I said, okay, let me play with this then. Let me take a look at it and actually look at the details of how it works and what it does. And so I read up on it and, trained up a GAN model, and, generating some data, and I'm getting some real insights from that. I've only been doing that over the last couple of weeks here. And been learning a number of things about how data works and what data is, what the distributions are, and so on and so forth. And that only strengthens my conviction that for us to go forward in ML, we're going to have to understand the domain very well, because it's necessarily a heuristic field. And so, yes, we can come up with theories that are true to some extent, but ultimately only so much as they can somehow encapsulate the general properties of data. For instance, there's the in signals processing world, right, where one is looking at doing a sampling. If your signal has a certain character to it, if it's band limited, then that if you sample a certain way with a certain frequency, you can perfectly reconstruct that data set. That type of idea, the Shannon-Nyquist sampling theorem, that type of idea can provide some guidance about what we can do within ML. But it's completely clear that, the Googles of this world would be completely outmatched by small teams of people, could be even 2 or 3 people who have expertise in their area and are working on those problems. And that's a very exciting time in history.
You mentioned this process of working with GANs, beyond reinforcing the value of domain expertise, kind of led to some insights around some of the core machine learning problems that you're working on. Can you elaborate on those a bit?
Right. So I want to write it up, put it on the archive. Some of these same type of ideas are some of the paradoxes are that more data is not necessarily better. That's kind of a big one. It's what type of data, right? And what problem are you trying to solve? Sometimes you actually need less data of a certain type. Sometimes when you have more data, you're diluting something, depending on what you're trying to accomplish.
And how do you know? What's this is probably what the thing that you need to write up, or that you're kind of moving towards writing up. But my sense is that there's, a set of kind of disciplines behind what you're saying that aren't really talked about a lot.
Right. This field is so nascent. This field of ML and data is wide open.
Yeah.
It's totally wide open. And I think there have been certain mantras that have been just regurgitated verbatim. But I think that, the more we look at it, the more we honestly look at it, right, as opposed to trying to force machine learning to fit a certain model, to fit a certain way of thinking. I think the more we honestly look at it, the more we'll be able to get deeper into what the character of this thing is. It comes down to specificity. What are we trying to do? And how are we trying to get there? In a data set, in a data distribution, for instance, there would be certain features, certain characteristics within certain neighborhoods of the distribution, which would be very different from other neighborhoods. And so if you're trying to capture the essence of a certain neighborhood of the data distribution, you're better off sampling from that area than coming up with, saying I have 10 million images, of this broad, ill-defined, data class, when in reality they're truly subfamilies, multiple subfamilies within that whole area. So one has to really understand what they're doing. One has to really understand what the landscape of that data type is, be it language, be it imaging, be it a particular type of imaging, and then guide that. So the human visual cortex and the human experience will remain in my view, will remain the ultimate arbiter for at least, for the next decade. Who knows what's going to happen after that?
Well, Stephen, it was great chatting with you about all this stuff. I'm looking forward to following along as you start to publish some of your insights into, GANs and this whole dynamic around data and domain expertise in machine learning. It's all really interesting stuff.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. It's really been an honor to be on your excellent show, and I'm looking forward to going through your entire archive. I am. It's really good quality, high quality stuff. Thank you for your contribution to the community.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen.
You're most welcome.
All right, everyone, that's our show for today. For more information on today's show, visit twimlai.com/shows. Make sure you head over to twimlcon.com to learn more about the TWIMLcon AI Platforms Conference. As always, thanks so much for listening, and catch you next time.